Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we step away from forests, abandoned buildings, and remote places, and instead enter a story that unfolded quietly between two people. It is a story not of disappearance, but of silence. The story is often known as that of the silent twins, two sisters named June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons. For most of their lives, the sisters spoke only to one another. To the outside world, they remained almost completely silent. They were born only minutes apart and grew up sharing nearly everything. From an early age, they seemed to move through life as a pair, connected in a way that even their family struggled to understand. As they became older, that connection grew stronger, but so did their distance from everyone else around them. Teachers, doctors, neighbors, and even family members found themselves unable to reach them. The sisters seemed to exist inside a world of their own, one built from private routines, secret conversations, and a bond so intense that it became difficult to separate one from the other. Over time, their story became stranger and more troubling. There were periods of deep isolation, attempts to separate them, unusual behavior, and later, a series of events that led them into the legal system and eventually into one of Britain's most secure psychiatric hospitals. Yet even after years of public attention, many questions remained. Why did the sisters stop speaking to others? What passed between them in private? And why did so many people who met them describe their connection as both fascinating and deeply unsettling? Unlike many mysteries, this story is not built around a single moment. Instead, it unfolds slowly over many years, shaped by loneliness, misunderstanding, and the unusual relationship between two sisters who seemed unable to live together, yet equally unable to live apart. As always, if you enjoy these calm and thoughtful documentaries, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps support more long-form stories told in a quiet and gentle way. Now settle in, allow the day to slowly drift away, and let us begin the remarkable and haunting story of the silent twins. June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons were born on April 11th, 1963, in Aden, where their father was serving with the Royal Air Force. They arrived only minutes apart and, from the beginning, seemed closely connected in a way that was stronger than many people expected, even for twins. Their parents, Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons, were originally from the Caribbean and had moved frequently because of their father's military career. The family eventually settled in Wales when the girls were still very young. The sisters spent much of their early childhood in the town of Haverfordwest. At first, they appeared much like other children. Family members later remembered them as bright, imaginative, and unusually close to one another. From a young age, June and Jennifer preferred to spend time together rather than with other children. They often played alone, creating games and routines that only the two of them seemed to understand. As toddlers, they shared toys, movements, and expressions in ways that sometimes appeared almost identical. Family members noticed that the sisters often mirrored one another. If one laughed, the other would laugh. If one sat quietly in a corner, the other would do the same. This closeness might not have seemed unusual at first. Many twins develop strong bonds during childhood, particularly when they spend much of their time together. Yet, as the years passed, the connection between June and Jennifer became more intense and more unusual. The girls developed a style of speaking that was difficult for others to understand. Their words often blended together into a fast and private rhythm. To those around them, it sounded almost like a language of its own. Teachers and family members struggled to follow their conversations. Even when the sisters were speaking English, they often did so in such a rapid and synchronized way that nobody else could understand what they were saying. By the time they reached school age, it had become clear that June and Jennifer were becoming increasingly withdrawn from the outside world. They were uncomfortable around other children and rarely interacted with adults. Instead, they seemed happiest when they were alone together. Their home became a private world shaped by their shared imagination and routines. The family also faced difficulties adjusting to life in Wales. As one of the few black families living in the area at the time, they often experienced isolation and prejudice. June and Jennifer stood out at school, and this may have deepened their tendency to withdraw into one another. Their parents tried to encourage them to socialize and participate in normal childhood activities. They hoped that, over time, the sisters would become more comfortable speaking to others. But the opposite seemed to happen. The older June and Jennifer became, the more they turned inward. Their world grew smaller, quieter, and more separate from everyone around them. By the end of childhood, the sisters had already begun to build the silent and private life that would later make them famous. To the outside world, they seemed distant and difficult to understand. Yet between themselves, their connection remained as strong as ever. As June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons grew older in Haverfordwest, the distance between the sisters and the outside world continued to widen. What had once seemed like an unusually close bond between twins gradually became something more, difficult for others to understand. At school, the sisters rarely joined in with the other children. They spoke very little in class and almost never participated in group activities. Teachers noticed that even when spoken to directly, the girls would often remain silent or answer only in the briefest possible way. Among themselves, however, they were very different. When they believed nobody was paying attention, they would speak quickly and continuously to one another. Their conversations seemed effortless and full of energy, yet they stopped immediately whenever another person came near. The other children at school struggled to understand them. Because June and Jennifer were so quiet and withdrawn, they were often seen as unusual. Some classmates teased them, while others simply avoided them. The sisters were also among the very few black children in the area. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, this made them stand out even more in the small Welsh town where they lived. They experienced prejudice and exclusion, and there were times when they were mocked because of the way they looked and behaved. For June and Jennifer, school became a place of discomfort rather than belonging. Instead of making friends, they withdrew further into one another. Each difficult day seemed to strengthen the private world they shared. At home, the sisters spent most of their time together in their bedroom. They played games, created routines, and acted out scenes from their imagination. They often dressed alike and moved in almost perfect synchronization, as though one sister could not act without the other. Their parents became increasingly worried. Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons wanted their daughters to have ordinary lives and friendships, but they found it difficult to reach them. The more they encouraged the girls to interact with others, the more the sisters seemed to retreat. Teachers and doctors began suggesting that the twins should be separated, believing that their intense bond might be preventing them from developing independently. The sisters were placed in different classrooms and, for a time, even sent to separate boarding schools. Instead of helping, the separation appeared to make things worse. Away from one another, June and Jennifer became deeply distressed. Both girls seemed anxious, withdrawn, and unhappy. When they were reunited, their behavior returned to what it had been before. They resumed their private conversations and seemed relieved to be together again, even though the closeness between them continued to worry those around them. By this point, the sisters were no longer simply quiet children. Their silence had become part of their identity. They seemed to have chosen each other over the rest of the world, creating a bond so strong that it left little room for anyone else. As the years passed, June and Jennifer would become even more isolated. Their private world would grow more complex, and the strange language they shared would become one of the most unusual parts of their story. One of the most unusual and mysterious aspects of the story of June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons was the way they communicated with one another. To almost everyone around them, the sisters appeared silent. Teachers, relatives, doctors, and classmates often spent long periods of time with them without hearing them say more than a few words. Yet, when June and Jennifer were alone together, they spoke constantly. The language they used was difficult for others to understand. Family members described it as a rapid, low, and almost musical way of speaking. The sisters spoke so quickly that the words seemed to run together into a single stream of sound. At first, adults assumed the girls were inventing their own language, something that can occasionally happen between very close twins. This phenomenon is sometimes called cryptophasia, a private style of communication that develops naturally between siblings who spend most of their time together. However, the language used by June and Jennifer seemed more unusual than that. It was not entirely separate from English. Instead, it appeared to be a version of English spoken at extraordinary speed, with shortened words and rhythms that only the two sisters could follow. Even their younger sister later said that she was one of the very few people who could partly understand them. To everyone else, the conversations remained private. Observers noticed that when June spoke, Jennifer often responded almost immediately, sometimes before June had even finished. Their exchanges moved so quickly that it was difficult to tell where one sister's voice ended and the other's began. The sisters also copied one another in other ways. They often mirrored each other's movements, expressions, and posture. If one crossed her arms, the other might do the same. If one turned her head or looked away, the other would follow within seconds. To some people, this made their relationship seem strangely synchronized, almost as though the sisters were acting as reflections of one another, rather than as separate individuals. As they grew older, the private language became more important to them. It allowed them to maintain a world that belonged only to the two of them. Within that world, June and Jennifer could speak freely, create stories, share thoughts, and express feelings that they refused to reveal to anyone else. At the same time, the secret language made it harder for other people to help them. Doctors and teachers could see that the sisters were intelligent and capable, but they could not understand what was happening inside their shared world. Attempts were made to record and study the sisters' speech. Some doctors slowed down audio recordings of their conversations and discovered that much of what they were saying could eventually be understood. The words themselves were not always unusual. What made them difficult to follow was the speed and the way the sisters had adapted the language into something private and exclusive. For June and Jennifer, this language was more than a way of speaking. It became a barrier between themselves and everyone else. The more isolated they felt from the outside world, the more they relied on their private conversations. And the more they relied on each other, the more difficult it became for either sister to imagine life apart. As June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons moved through their school years, life outside their home became increasingly difficult. The sisters had already struggled to communicate with others, but the environment around them only seemed to deepen their isolation. At school in Haverfordwest, June and Jennifer were seen as different from the other children. Their silence, their unusual closeness, and the private way they interacted made them stand out immediately. The sisters were also among the very few black students in the area. Because of this, they experienced prejudice and exclusion from an early age. Some children mocked them, while others avoided them completely. Teachers later recalled that the girls often appeared nervous and uncomfortable in class. They rarely looked directly at others and almost never volunteered to speak. When asked a question, one sister might glance toward the other before responding, as though neither felt able to speak alone. Often they would remain silent altogether. The bullying they experienced added to this withdrawal. June and Jennifer were teased because of the way they spoke, the way they dressed, and the fact that they spent all of their time together. As the years passed, the sisters stopped trying to fit in. Instead of reaching outward, they retreated further into the world they had created between themselves. At break times, they stayed apart from the other children. They often walked together in silence or sat alone, avoiding the noise and activity around them. Their teachers became increasingly concerned. The girls were intelligent and capable, yet they seemed unable or unwilling to participate in ordinary school life. Because of this, school officials and doctors suggested that the sisters should be separated. They believed that the bond between June and Jennifer had become unhealthy, and that each sister needed the opportunity to develop independently. The sisters were placed in separate classrooms. Later, they were even sent to different boarding schools in an attempt to break the pattern. Instead of helping, the separation had a powerful and troubling effect on them. Away from each other, both girls became withdrawn to an even greater degree. June later described feeling as though part of herself had been removed. Jennifer also struggled, becoming quiet and emotionally distressed. At school, both sisters spent long periods refusing to speak at all. Teachers and classmates found it almost impossible to connect with them. The attempt to separate them seemed to confirm something that had already been growing for years. June and Jennifer were so closely connected that being apart caused them genuine pain. Yet being together seemed to keep them trapped in the same silent pattern. By the end of their school years, the sisters had become almost completely isolated from the outside world. They had no close friends, very little connection to other people, and little sense of belonging anywhere except with each other. Their silence, which had begun as a childhood habit, had now become something much deeper. It was no longer simply a way of avoiding others. It had become the foundation of the unusual and private life they shared. As the outside world became more distant, June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons turned more deeply toward the private world they had created together. Inside their shared room and within the quiet routines of daily life, the sisters built a world of imagination that was rich, detailed, and known only to them. Much of this world was expressed through writing. Both sisters kept journals and spent long periods writing stories, poems, and plays. Unlike their silence in public, their writing was full of emotion and detail. June and Jennifer each developed their own characters and fictional worlds. They wrote about relationships, jealousy, love, betrayal, and escape. Many of the stories centered on people who felt trapped or misunderstood. Although the sisters rarely spoke to others, they seemed able to express themselves more freely on paper. Their notebooks became a place where thoughts and feelings that were hidden from everyone else could finally appear. June Gibbons was especially interested in writing romantic stories and imagined dramas. She created characters who longed for connection and struggled to find a place in the world. Jennifer Gibbons often wrote darker stories, sometimes involving violence, tension, and emotional conflict. Her writing revealed feelings of anger and frustration that she rarely showed in real life. The sisters also created games and routines that they acted out together. They spent hours inside their bedroom, performing scenes from the stories they had written. To them, these imagined worlds seemed more real and more comfortable than ordinary life. Inside them, the sisters could control what happened and remain together without interference from anyone else. At times, however, this private world also seemed to create tension between them. Their journals reveal that the sisters loved one another deeply, yet they also felt trapped by the intensity of their connection. Both June and Jennifer sometimes wrote about feeling controlled by the other. Each sister seemed to believe that the other had become too powerful within their shared life. June later wrote that being with Jennifer felt like living in the shadow of another person. Jennifer expressed similar feelings, describing their relationship as something she could not escape. Their bond was so close that it left little room for either sister to develop an identity of her own. They depended on one another completely, yet this dependence also caused resentment and conflict. The sisters sometimes argued intensely in private. There were even periods when they stopped speaking to each other temporarily, creating a strange silence within the silence that already separated them from the rest of the world. Yet, no matter how much tension existed between them, they always returned to one another. Their private world remained the only place where they truly felt understood. By the time they reached adolescence, June and Jennifer had become almost entirely absorbed in this inner life. Their stories, journals, and routines provided comfort. But they also deepened the separation between the sisters and everyone else around them, as concern about their behavior continued to grow. Doctors and family members began to believe that something more serious was happening. Soon, new attempts would be made to separate the sisters and force them into a different life. By the time June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons reached their teenage years, the concern surrounding their relationship had become impossible for teachers, doctors, and family members to ignore. To many of the adults around them, the sisters seemed trapped in a bond that was preventing either of them from developing as an individual. They appeared unable to speak to other people, unable to make friends, and unable to function independently. As a result, several professionals came to believe that the only solution was to separate them. The first attempts were relatively small. June and Jennifer were placed in different classrooms at school so that they would spend less time together during the day. Teachers hoped that, away from one another, the girls would gradually begin to interact with other children. Instead, the opposite happened. Separated from her sister, each girl became even quieter than before. Both seemed anxious and withdrawn. They often refused to speak at all and spent long periods sitting silently by themselves. Because the classroom separation did not appear to work, the next step was more serious. The sisters were sent to different boarding schools, sometimes many miles apart. The hope was that a complete separation would encourage each sister to build a separate identity and form new relationships. For June and Jennifer, however, the experience was deeply upsetting. Both girls struggled emotionally and became increasingly distressed. Teachers at the boarding schools later described them as lonely, withdrawn, and difficult to reach. They remained almost completely silent and showed little interest in speaking with those around them. At times, the sisters seemed to lose their sense of direction without one another. The strange closeness that had worried adults now appeared to be something they depended upon in order to function. Eventually, the separation ended and the sisters were reunited. Yet when they returned to one another, nothing had changed in the way the adults had hoped. Instead, the bond between them seemed even stronger than before. Doctors and psychologists began studying the sisters more closely. Some believed they were suffering from a psychological condition linked to their extreme dependence on one another. Others believed that years of isolation, prejudice, and bullying had caused them to retreat so deeply into their private world that they no longer knew how to live outside it. One of the professionals who spent the most time with the sisters was Marjorie Wallace, a journalist who later became close to June and Jennifer and wrote extensively about their lives. Wallace observed that the sisters did not simply love each other in the ordinary way that siblings might. Their relationship seemed to contain both affection and conflict in equal measure. They depended on each other completely, yet they also seemed to compete for control within the relationship. At times, one sister would become dominant, while the other would become quieter and more passive. The adults around them increasingly felt that the sisters could neither remain together nor successfully live apart. This created a difficult and painful situation. Every attempt to separate them caused suffering, yet leaving them together appeared to deepen the unusual patterns that had defined their lives since childhood. As the years passed, the frustration and tension within the sisters' private world began to grow. Their isolation became more severe, and eventually, their behavior would move beyond silence and into something much more troubling. By the late 1970s, the lives of June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons had become increasingly troubled. Years of silence, isolation, and emotional tension had left the sisters feeling trapped inside the small private world they had created together. As they entered their late teenage years, that frustration began to appear in more destructive ways. The sisters had always spent much of their time inside their room, writing stories and acting out imagined lives. But gradually, their private world no longer seemed enough. June and Jennifer began spending time outside the house in ways that alarmed their family. They would disappear for long periods, wander through the town, and sometimes become involved in petty acts of vandalism and theft. The behavior soon became more serious. The sisters were accused of shoplifting and of setting small fires. One of the incidents involved a fire started in a local store. Another involved an empty building. The damage was limited, and no one was seriously hurt, but the events caused concern within the community. To those around them, the crimes seemed confusing. June and Jennifer had always been quiet and withdrawn. Yet, beneath that silence, there appeared to be deep anger and emotional turmoil. Later, both sisters would write about these feelings in their journals. They described themselves as feeling trapped, restless, and unable to escape the strange relationship that had defined their entire lives. The fires, in particular, seemed to represent something more than simple rebellion. Some observers believed they were an expression of the sisters' desire to break free from the life they had been living. Eventually, the sisters were arrested and brought before the courts. During the court proceedings, June and Jennifer remained much as they had always been. They spoke very little and seemed detached from what was happening around them. The legal system struggled to understand them. The sisters did not fit easily into ordinary ideas about criminal behavior. They were not violent in the usual sense, nor did they appear fully aware of the reasons behind what they had done. After considering the case, the court decided that the sisters required psychiatric treatment rather than a traditional prison sentence. As a result, June and Jennifer were sent to Broadmoor Hospital, one of the most secure psychiatric hospitals in Britain. At the time, Broadmoor was known for housing individuals who had committed serious crimes or who were considered a danger to themselves or others. For many people, the decision seemed extreme. The crimes committed by the sisters had been relatively minor, yet they were being sent to one of the country's most secure institutions. June and Jennifer would remain there for many years. Their arrival at Broadmoor marked the beginning of the next stage of their story. The sisters were now separated from ordinary life more completely than ever before. Yet, even inside the hospital, their unusual bond continued, and the strange and troubling relationship between them would take on a new and even darker form. When June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons arrived at Broadmoor Hospital, they entered an environment very different from anything they had known before. Broadmoor was one of the most secure psychiatric hospitals in Britain. High walls, locked doors, and strict routines shaped daily life inside the institution. Many of the patients there had committed serious crimes or were considered dangerous. For June and Jennifer, the hospital was both a place of treatment and another form of isolation. They had already spent much of their lives separated from the outside world, and now they found themselves living inside a highly controlled environment. The sisters remained there for more than a decade. During those years, doctors and nurses continued to study their unusual relationship. They hoped that the structured environment of the hospital might help the sisters communicate more openly and begin to live more independently. Instead, much of the same pattern continued. June and Jennifer still spoke very little to other people. They communicated mostly with each other, often through notes, brief conversations, or the private language they had used since childhood. At times, the sisters refused to speak entirely. There were periods when they became silent even with one another, creating long stretches of quiet that worried the staff. The tension between them also seemed to grow stronger inside the hospital. Although they remained closely connected, their relationship had become more complicated and painful. The sisters often described feeling trapped by one another. June believed that Jennifer controlled much of their shared life. Jennifer sometimes expressed similar feelings about June. Doctors observed that the sisters appeared unable to function together peacefully, yet they also seemed unable to survive apart. When separated, both became distressed. When reunited, conflict soon returned. During their time in Broadmoor, the sisters continued to write. Their journals became an important record of what they were feeling. In these writings, both sisters described their relationship as something powerful but destructive. They often wrote about the sense that one of them would have to change or disappear before the other could truly live. This idea appeared again and again in their journals. The sisters seemed to believe that their bond had become so strong that there was no room for both of them to exist as separate individuals. Marjorie Wallace continued to visit them during this period and became one of the few people who gained their trust. Through Wallace, the sisters slowly began speaking more openly about their thoughts and fears. Yet, even then, much of what they said remained difficult to understand. Inside Broadmoor, time passed slowly. The years moved on, but the strange pattern of dependence, resentment, and silence remained unchanged. Eventually, the sisters came to believe that there was only one way their lives could ever be different. It was a belief that would lead to one of the most unsettling moments in their story. During their years inside Broadmoor Hospital, the relationship between June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons became even more intense and difficult to understand. The sisters had spent their entire lives bound to one another. They had grown up speaking only to each other, sharing the same private world, and living in a way that seemed to leave little space for separate identities. By the time they were adults, both June and Jennifer had begun to believe that this connection had become impossible to escape. In their journals and conversations with Marjorie Wallace, the sisters often spoke about the idea that one of them would have to die in order for the other to live a normal life. At first, these comments may have seemed symbolic, reflecting the emotional weight of their relationship. Yet over time, the idea became more direct and more serious. According to Wallace, the sisters eventually made a strange and deeply unsettling promise between themselves. They decided that one of them would die so that the other could finally be free. The sisters believed that their lives had become so closely tied together that neither could fully exist while the other remained. They felt trapped in a pattern of silence, dependence, and conflict that had lasted since childhood. Between the two of them, it was eventually agreed that Jennifer Gibbons would be the one to die. The reasons behind this decision remain difficult to fully understand. Jennifer herself reportedly told Wallace that she had chosen this role willingly. She is said to have believed that June had a better chance of surviving independently, and that her own death might allow her sister to finally live a more ordinary life. To many people, this idea seemed impossible to comprehend. Yet, within the strange and isolated world shared by the sisters, it appears to have made a certain kind of sense. For years, June and Jennifer had seen themselves almost as two halves of the same person. They had struggled to separate their thoughts, emotions, and identities. The promise between them reflected the tragic way in which they had come to understand their own lives. As time passed, staff at Broadmoor noticed subtle changes in the sisters. Jennifer appeared calmer and more accepting, while June seemed uncertain and increasingly anxious. Eventually, arrangements were made for the sisters to be transferred from Broadmoor to a less restrictive hospital. It was during this journey, while the sisters were travelling together, that the strange promise between them would take on an even darker meaning. In March of 1993, after many years inside Broadmoor Hospital, arrangements were made for June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons to be transferred to another hospital with fewer restrictions. The sisters had spent more than 11 years at Broadmoor, although their relationship remained unusual and difficult. Doctors believed that they no longer required such a highly secure environment. On the day of the transfer, June and Jennifer travelled together in a vehicle on the journey to the new hospital. During the trip, something unexpected happened. According to June, Jennifer suddenly rested her head against her sister and seemed to fall asleep. At first, nothing appeared unusual. However, by the time the vehicle arrived, it became clear that Jennifer was seriously ill. She was taken for medical treatment, but soon afterward, she died. Jennifer Gibbons was only 29 years old. The cause of death was later recorded as sudden inflammation of the heart. a rare condition known as acute myocarditis. Doctors did not find any evidence of poison, violence, or suicide. Even so, the timing of Jennifer's death caused many people to remember the strange promise the sisters had spoken about for years. Jennifer had repeatedly said that one of them would need to die so that the other could live freely. She had even suggested that she herself would be the one. For those who knew the story, her death seemed almost impossible to separate from those earlier words. June herself later spoke about the event in a quiet and thoughtful way. She said that Jennifer had seemed calm on the journey and that she believed her sister had chosen what was going to happen. Whether this was meant literally or emotionally is difficult to know. The doctors and nurses involved in the case remained cautious. There was no evidence that Jennifer's death had been caused intentionally. From a medical perspective, it appeared to be a tragic and natural event. Yet because of the unusual relationship between the sisters, the death has continued to feel mysterious to many people. After Jennifer died, something changed in June. For the first time in her life, she began speaking more openly to other people. The silence that had surrounded her for so many years gradually began to lift. June later said that after Jennifer's death, she felt free. She moved away from the hospital environment and began living a quieter and more independent life. In some ways, it seemed that the strange belief shared by the sisters had come true. After Jennifer died, June was finally able to live separately and speak to the world around her. Yet this change came at an enormous cost. The death of Jennifer Gibbons remains one of the most haunting parts of the story, not because of what can be proven, but because of the strange and deeply emotional connection that existed between the sisters until the very end. The story of June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons continues to fascinate people because it feels both deeply human and strangely difficult to understand. Unlike many mysteries, there is no missing object to find and no single event to explain. Instead, the mystery exists inside the relationship between two sisters, whose lives became so closely connected that it seemed impossible to separate one from the other. Part of what makes their story so powerful is that it raises questions without offering easy answers. Why did the sisters choose silence? Why did they speak only to one another? And how did a bond that began in childhood grow into something that seemed to control every part of their lives? Many people who hear the story see it as an example of loneliness and isolation. June and Jennifer grew up in a place where they felt different from those around them. They experienced prejudice, struggled to make friends, and often felt excluded from the world outside their family. Over time, that isolation may have caused the sisters to retreat further into each other. Their private language, shared routines, and imagined world offered comfort and safety. Yet the same things that protected them also made it harder for them to connect with anyone else. The story is also often discussed in relation to mental health. Doctors and psychologists have tried to understand the sisters through different explanations, including selective mutism, emotional dependence, and the psychological effects of being twins who were treated as a pair rather than as individuals. Even today, there is no complete agreement about what June and Jennifer experienced. Some believe their behavior was mainly the result of years of loneliness and misunderstanding. Others think there may have been deeper psychological factors that nobody fully understood at the time. The sisters have also remained memorable because of the unusual contradiction at the center of their relationship. They loved each other deeply and depended on each other completely, yet they also felt trapped by one another. This mixture of closeness and conflict appears again and again in their journals. Both sisters wanted freedom, but neither seemed able to imagine life without the other. Their relationship became both a refuge and a prison. The death of Jennifer Gibbons has only added to the lasting power of the story. After years of speaking about the idea that one of them would need to die, Jennifer's death seemed to change June in exactly the way the sisters had predicted. Afterward, June Gibbons began speaking more openly and living more independently. Too many people, This change feels difficult to explain, which is one reason the story continues to feel so haunting. Books, documentaries, and articles about the silent twins continue to appear because the story touches on themes that many people recognize in some way. The desire to belong, the fear of being misunderstood, and the struggle to become an individual are all part of what makes the sisters' lives feel so memorable. Yet there is also something in their story that remains just beyond explanation. Even after all these years, June and Jennifer still seem to belong partly to the ordinary world and partly to a private world that only the two of them ever truly understood. As our story comes gently to an end tonight, the lives of June Gibbons and Jennifer Gibbons remain quiet and difficult to fully understand. Unlike many mysteries, there is no hidden object, no missing place, and no final discovery waiting at the end. Instead, the mystery of the silent twins lives within the bond between two sisters who spent nearly their entire lives speaking only to each other. Their story began in childhood, with two girls who felt alone in the world around them. Over time, that loneliness drew them closer together, until the connection between them became stronger than any relationship either of them had with anyone else. For June and Jennifer, that bond brought comfort, understanding, and safety. Yet it also brought silence, dependence, and pain. The very thing that protected them from the outside world also made it difficult for them to live within it. Perhaps that is why their story continues to stay with so many people. Most of us know what it feels like to want to be understood, to feel different, or to struggle to explain ourselves to others. In the lives of the silent twins, those feelings became more intense and more visible than most people could imagine. After the death of Jennifer Gibbons, June Gibbons finally began to live a more independent life. The silence that had surrounded her for so many years slowly began to lift. Yet even then, the story did not truly end. The memory of the sisters, their private language, and the world they shared has remained. If you found tonight's documentary.com interesting or moving, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps support more long-form stories told in a quiet and thoughtful way. And now, as the night grows still, you can allow the story of the silent twins to slowly drift into the distance. Two sisters, two voices, and a world that only they could ever completely understand.